The snow was falling hard across the Belgian countryside in December 1944. It was the dead of winter, and the Battle of the Bulge was raging, Hitler's last desperate gamble to turn the tide of World War II. The forests were thick, the roads slick with ice, and the small villages of the Ardennes had become killing grounds. But amid that chaos, an act of horror unfolded that history almost buried. It began with 11 black American soldiers, men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were trained soldiers, skilled gunners, patriots in uniform. Yet to their captors, they were something less than human. What happened to those 11 men would become one of the most brutal and shameful atrocities committed by the Waffen-SS during the entire war. Their names were Thomas Forte, George Davis, William Pritchett, Robert Greene, Nathaniel Moss, James Stewart, George Moten, Major Bradley, James Leatherwood, George W. Davis, and Dew Turner. 11 names, once lost in the noise of war, now echo as a reminder of both courage and cruelty. These men were part of a segregated U.S. Army unit, black soldiers fighting for a country that, in 1944, still didn't grant them equal rights at home. Yet when the call came, they went anyway. They fought not just against the Axis, but against prejudice and doubt. In December 1944, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was stationed near the Belgian town of Wereth, supporting the front lines with heavy artillery fire. When the Germans launched their massive surprise offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, the American lines were thrown into chaos. The 333rd position came under intense fire from advancing SS Panzer divisions. Amid the confusion, many soldiers were forced to retreat through dense forests and freezing temperatures, trying desperately to regroup. 11 of them never made it back. Exhausted, hungry, and freezing, those men wandered through the countryside for hours. Finally, they reached a small farmhouse in the hamlet of Wereth. The house belonged to the Lange family, local Belgian civilians who had been sympathetic to Allied troops. Despite the danger, the Langes offered food and shelter. They knew that helping the Americans could bring death upon their family. But humanity triumphed over fear that night. For a few brief hours, the soldiers warmed their hands, ate, and rested, believing they had found safety. But safety was an illusion. A local collaborator, someone who supported the Germans, noticed the Americans and reported them to the nearby SS troops. Within hours, a squad of Waffen-SS soldiers from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, arrived. These were some of the most fanatical and ruthless soldiers in the German army, personally sworn to Hitler. When they captured the 11 black soldiers, what followed defied the rules of war and basic humanity. Men were taken to a nearby field. There was no trial, no questioning, only hatred. The SS troops beat them, stripped them of their winter clothing, and forced them into the snow. Witnesses later reported hearing screams, gunshots, and cruel laughter echoing through the frozen air. The soldiers were tortured before being executed, one by one, in acts of unimaginable brutality. When their bodies were later discovered by American forces, the scene told a story too horrible to fully describe. Bones were broken, faces mutilated, and limbs shattered. Some had been shot while trying to crawl away. Others appeared to have been beaten to death. The massacre at Wereth was not a random act of violence. It was a deliberate display of Nazi racial hatred. The SS, indoctrinated with ideas of Aryan supremacy, viewed black soldiers as subhuman. They had been told that fighting against such men was not just a military duty, but a racial one. Killing them was seen as cleansing. To the SS, these 11 Americans were less than soldiers. They were symbols of everything the Nazi ideology despised: courage, defiance, and equality. When U.S. troops finally liberated Wereth, they found the bodies half buried in snow. An Army war crimes investigation was launched, but as the Cold War emerged and priorities shifted, the case was quietly closed. The massacre was overshadowed by larger events, forgotten in the avalanche of post-war politics. No one was ever charged. No SS officer was brought to justice for the murders of those 11 men. For decades, the story of the Wereth 11 remained hidden, whispered among historians, but absent from mainstream memory. But their story didn't end in that frozen field. It lived on through survivors of the 333rd, through the Lange family who never forgot their sacrifice, and through the people who refused to let history erase what happened. The Wereth 11 represent more than a war crime. They represent a painful truth about both the enemy they faced and the country they served. These men gave their lives in a world that judged them by their skin, but history now honors them for their strength, bravery, and the purity of their sacrifice. As the years passed, researchers and families of the victims began piecing together the fragments of that forgotten night. In the early 1990s, the full story of the Wereth 11 began to emerge again, brought forward by historians and veterans who wanted justice, not vengeance, but remembrance. The small field in Wereth, once silent and forgotten, became sacred ground. A memorial now stands there, bearing the names of the 11 soldiers. It was built not by governments or armies, but by private citizens, ordinary people who believed that heroes should never fade from memory. Each year, visitors from around the world come to Wereth to pay their respects. They leave flowers, medals, and letters. Some come silently and weep. Others stand at attention, saluting the men who fought for freedom, equality, and human dignity. The wind still howls across those Belgian hills, whispering their names into eternity. The massacre of the Wereth 11 is more than a tragedy, it's a mirror. It reflects the cost of hatred and the courage it takes to fight it. Those men faced two enemies, the Nazi regime abroad and the racism that shadowed them at home. Yet when the world needed heroes, they didn't hesitate. They carried the flag of a country that didn't yet see them as equals, and they carried it with pride. Their story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that freedom has often been defended by those who had to fight twice as hard to claim it. The Wereth 11 stand as proof that valor has no color, and that even in the darkest moments of war, the light of human decency can still shine. The next time you hear about the Battle of the Bulge, remember the soldiers of Wereth, not just as victims, but as warriors. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and ultimately betrayed, but they never surrendered. Their courage broke through the frozen silence of history to remind us that justice delayed must never become justice denied. Their blood spilled in the snow is not just part of the story of World War II, it's part of the story of America itself. And though the men who killed them may have vanished into the shadows, the names of the Wereth 11 will forever stand in the light. If stories like this move you, if you believe forgotten heroes deserve their voices back, then stand with us. Subscribe to *Warlog and help keep their memory alive. These are not just stories from history, they are reminders of what we must never become and what we must always fight to protect: humanity, honor, and truth. The snow that buried the bodies of the 11 soldiers eventually melted, but the silence around their story lasted for decades. After the war ended in 1945, Allied investigators arrived in Wereth and documented what they saw. The official U.S. Army report described the scene in careful, clinical language, but even on paper, the horror was unmistakable. The soldiers had been mutilated and tortured before death. Their hands were shattered, their faces crushed, and their bodies riddled with bullets. The report concluded that the men had been mistreated in violation of the laws of war. Yet despite the evidence, despite eyewitness accounts, the case was soon closed. The reason was politics. The war had shifted into a new era, the Cold War, and the United States suddenly needed Germany as an ally against the Soviet Union. Pursuing Nazi war criminals, especially low-ranking SS troops, was no longer a priority. In the race to rebuild Europe and contain communism, justice for 11 black soldiers from Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas was quietly abandoned. Their families received only a notice: killed in action. No details, no closure. The mothers and wives who waited for news were left with silence. Letters came home from the War Department that spoke in vague terms of sacrifice and honor. But the truth of what had happened in Wereth, the brutality, the hatred, the inhumanity, was hidden in classified files. For many of the families, the grief turned into quiet endurance. They buried empty coffins and prayed that one day someone would tell the world what those men had suffered. For nearly half a century, the Wereth 11 were ghosts of history. Their names were absent from textbooks, from memorials, even from many military records. They had been erased not just by their killers, but by time and indifference. It wasn't until 1994 that the silence began to break. A Belgian man named Herman Langer the son of the family who had tried to shelter the soldiers, could not forget what had happened outside his parents' farmhouse. He reached out to American historians, determined that the truth would not die with him. Through his efforts and those of several veterans groups, the story of the Wereth 11 was rediscovered. Old documents were unearthed, interviews conducted, and the Army's forgotten reports were pulled from archives. Slowly, the mosaic of tragedy was pieced together again. In 1994, a small granite memorial was built on the very spot where the men were murdered. It was a quiet, solemn place, no parades, no politicians, just a field, a plaque, and 11 names carved into stone. For the families of the victims, the memorial became sacred ground. When they visited, they saw not just loss, but justice taking root at last. They finally have a place in history, said one descendant. They fought for a country that didn't see them as equals, but today the world knows who they were. The dedication ceremony was attended by Americans, Belgians, and even German citizens, people united not by race or nationality, but by remembrance. In the years that followed, awareness of the Wereth 11 grew. Documentaries, books, and educational programs began to tell their story. The U.S. military officially recognized the massacre as a war crime. In 2011, the U.S. Congress honored the Wereth 11 with a formal resolution of remembrance. Schools in America and Europe began teaching their story alongside other war atrocities like Malmedy and Rediscovery. The silence that had once buried them was finally broken. But the legacy of the Wereth 11 isn't only about the cruelty of the SS, it's about what they represent in the larger story of World War II. They fought for a country that segregated them, in an army that often doubted their worth. They endured insults and injustice even while risking their lives for freedom. Yet when faced with the enemy, they showed courage equal to any soldier on the front lines. They didn't surrender easily, they fought to the end. And even in death, their sacrifice forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths about racism, both in Nazi ideology and in America's own history. The story of Wereth also changed how historians viewed the role of black soldiers in World War II. For decades, their contributions were minimized or ignored. Yet over 1 million African Americans served in that war as engineers, tankers, medics, pilots, and gunners. They fought in North Africa, in Italy, in Normandy, and in the Ardennes. They helped liberate Europe even while their own communities remained unfree. The Wereth 11 came to symbolize all of them, the men and women who fought 2 wars at once, one against tyranny overseas and one against discrimination at home. Today the field of Wereth looks peaceful again. Green grass sways where snow once covered horror. The memorial stands quietly among the hills, guarded by the wind and watched over by the sky. Travelers who pass through often stop, not out of obligation but out of respect. They read the names, they stand in silence, and in that silence they can almost hear the echoes, the crack of gunfire, the shouts, the fadding heartbeat of courage. It's easy to think of history as distant, but Wereth reminds us that humanity's darkest and brightest moments often coexist. 11 men died because of hatred, but their story survived because of compassion, the compassion of a Belgian family who risked everything to help them, and of strangers decades later who refused to let them be forgotten. Each person who learns their names keeps that compassion alive. When you watch the snow fall or the flag wave in the wind, remember that freedom has a cost written in both blood and memory. Remember that these 11 soldiers did not die in vain. Their deaths exposed the true face of evil, and their remembrance exposes the strength of truth. The Wereth 11 stand among history's bravest, their courage undimmed, their sacrifice unforgotten. They are proof that even when justice is delayed, dignity endures. Theirs is not just a war story, it's a human story. So the next time someone tells you history repeats itself, tell them about Wereth. Tell them about the 333rd Battalion, about the frozen night when courage met cruelty, and about how love of country can outlive hate. Tell them that the price of silence is forgetting and that we owe it to the fallen to speak their names. If their story has reached you tonight, don't let it fade. Share it, keep it alive, because remembrance is resistance and silence is surrender. If you believe these men deserve to be remembered not as victims, but as heroes, subscribe to Warlog. Join this mission to uncover the hidden stories of war, the ones buried beneath propaganda, politics, and time. Together, we can make sure that men like Thomas Forte, George Davis, William Pritchett, Robert Greene, Nathaniel Moss, James Stewart, George Moton, Major Bradley, James Leatherwood, George W. Davis, and Hugh Turner are never forgotten again. They were more than soldiers. They were sons, brothers, fathers, and friends. They were Americans, and though the SS tried to erase them, history will forever write their names in light.